There are places on this earth where time seems to fold in on itself, where the boundaries between the present and the ancient past blur into something almost unrecognizable. Deep in the Shanxi Province of northern China, carved into the rust-colored cliffs of the Zhongnan Mountains, exists a network of caves that have served as refuges for those seeking escape from the world for more than 1,500 years. These are not the tourist-friendly grottos with neon lighting and guided tours. These are raw, cold hollows in the mountainside, some barely large enough to lie down in, others opening into chambers where the echo of a single breath can sound like the whisper of ghosts. The air inside carries the mineral scent of stone that has never known sunlight, mixed with the faint, earthy smell of incense burned by generations of hermits who believed that suffering in solitude was the only path to enlightenment. It was into one of these caves, in the autumn of 1990, that a man named Yun Feng walked with nothing but a bamboo mat, a clay water jug, and a determination to sever every thread that connected him to the life he had known. Yun Feng was not born into poverty, nor was he fleeing a criminal past. He was 32 years old when he made his decision, a man who had grown up in the suburbs of Taiyuan, the capital city of Shanxi, during the tumultuous years following the Cultural Revolution. His father had been a school teacher, his mother a seamstress, and together they had raised Yun Feng and his two younger sisters in a modest apartment that overlooked a street lined with poplar trees. By all accounts, his childhood was unremarkable. He attended school. He played basketball with neighborhood boys. He dreamed of becoming an engineer, but somewhere in his late 20s, after completing his education and taking a position at a state-owned machinery plant, something inside Yun Feng began to crack. Friends would later describe it as a gradual withdrawal, a slow dimming of the light behind his eyes. He stopped attending social gatherings. He spent his lunch breaks alone, staring out the factory windows at the smog-choked horizon. He began reading Buddhist texts with an intensity that worried his family, underlining passages about the illusion of the self and the necessity of renunciation with such force that the ink bled through the pages. His mother noticed the change first. She would find him sitting in the dark apartment at night, his dinner untouched, his gaze fixed on nothing. When she asked what was wrong, he would only shake his head and say that the noise of the world had become unbearable. He spoke of the city as if it were a living thing that was devouring him piece by piece, the honking horns and factory sirens and endless chatter of voices all merging into a kind of existential scream that he could no longer silence. His father, a pragmatic man who had survived the upheavals of Mao's China by keeping his head down and his thoughts to himself, dismissed it as a phase, perhaps a delayed reaction to the pressures of adulthood. But Yun Feng's sisters could see that this was something deeper, something that words could not quite capture. He had begun to speak of the self as a prison, of desire as a chain, of the very act of living in society as a form of spiritual suffocation. And then, one morning in September of 1990, he simply did not show up for work. His parents found a note on the kitchen table, written in careful, measured characters. It said only that he had gone to find silence, and that they should not look for him. The Zhongnan Mountains had been a destination for hermits since the Tang dynasty, a place where monks and mystics retreated to meditate in isolation, sometimes for years, sometimes for entire lifetimes. The tradition had waned during the decades of communist rule, when religion was suppressed and the mountains were deemed too remote for productive labor. But by the late 1980s, a quiet resurgence had begun. Word spread among spiritual seekers that the old caves were still there, still empty, still waiting. Yun Feng had heard the stories from a monk he had met at a temple on the outskirts of Taiwan, an elderly man with skin like crumpled paper, who spoke of the caves as if they were living entities, breathing with the rhythm of the earth itself. The monk told him that true peace could only be found in absolute solitude, that the mind could not be quieted while it was still tethered to the world of forms and names and obligations. Yun Feng listened with the desperation of a drowning man being offered a rope. Within weeks, he had quit his job, sold what few possessions he owned, and used the money to buy supplies for the journey. He did not say goodbye to his friends. He barely said goodbye to his family. He simply left, walking out of the city as the morning mist clung to the streets, and began the long trek into the mountains. The climb took him 3 days. The terrain was unforgiving, a labyrinth of steep trails and loose scree that could send a careless traveler tumbling into the ravines below. Yun Feng carried his belongings in a canvas sack slung over his shoulder, his breath coming in short, hard gasps as the altitude increased and the air grew thinner. He passed through villages where children stared at him from doorways, their eyes wide with curiosity and a kind of pity, as if they could already see the fate that awaited him. He slept under the stars, wrapped in a thin blanket, listening to the wind move through the pines like a mournful song. On the 3rd day, he reached the network of caves that the monk had described. They dotted the cliffside like the eyes of some ancient sleeping god, dark openings that seemed to pull at him with a gravitational force he could not resist. He chose one near the top of the ridge, a chamber roughly 10 feet deep and 8 feet wide, with a ceiling just high enough for him to stand upright. The floor was covered in a fine layer of dust, and the walls bore the faint traces of old soot from fires long extinguished. There was a narrow ledge at the entrance that overlooked the valley below, a dizzying drop that made his stomach clench even as his spirits soared. This, he decided, would be his home. The first weeks were a kind of agony. Yun Feng had romanticized the idea of solitude, imagining it as a serene embrace, a gentle descent into inner peace. But the reality was brutal. The silence was not peaceful. It was oppressive, a weight that pressed down on him from all sides, filling his ears with the sound of his own heartbeat, his own breath, his own thoughts churning in endless, maddening loops. He had brought with him a small supply of rice and dried vegetables, which he rationed carefully, eating only once a day to make them last. Water he collected from a spring a mile down the mountain, a grueling descent and ascent that left his legs trembling and his back slick with sweat. He spent his days sitting cross-legged on his bamboo mat, trying to meditate, trying to find the stillness that the monk had promised. But his mind would not cooperate. It threw up memories like a projector stuck on repeat. Images of his mother's worried face, his father's disappointed silence, his sisters laughing at some joke he could no longer remember. He saw his old apartment, the factory where he had worked, the streets of Taiyuan with their endless noise and motion, and beneath it all was a gnawing question that he could not silence. Had he made a terrible mistake? But Yun Feng was nothing if not stubborn. He had not come all this way to turn back at the first sign of difficulty. He began to impose a strict discipline on himself, rising before dawn, washing his face with cold water from the jug, sitting in meditation until the sun climbed high enough to warm the cave entrance. He ate sparingly, forcing himself to chew each grain of rice slowly, mindfully, as if the act of eating were itself a form of prayer. He recited sutras he had memorized, the syllables rolling off his tongue in a rhythmic chant that seemed to vibrate in the stone walls around him. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. The silence stopped feeling like an enemy and started to feel like a companion. The loneliness did not disappear, but it became familiar, a presence he could coexist with rather than fight against. His thoughts, which had once roared through his mind like a river in flood, began to slow, to settle, to clarify. He started to notice things he had never noticed before, the way the light changed as it moved across the valley, the intricate patterns of lichen growing on the cave walls, the sound of a bird calling in the distance, sharp and clear as a bell. Months turned into years. Yun Feng lost track of time in the conventional sense. He marked the passage of seasons by the temperature of the air, the length of the days, the types of plants that bloomed in the valley below. Winter was the hardest, when the cold seeped into his bones and the spring froze solid, forcing him to melt snow for water. He wrapped himself in every scrap of fabric he owned and huddled near the small fire he allowed himself, feeding it twigs and dried grass he had collected during the warmer months. Spring brought a kind of euphoria, the world exploding into green and gold. the air thick with the scent of wildflowers and the sound of insects buzzing in lazy clouds. Summer was a time of plenty, when he could forage for mushrooms and wild greens to supplement his dwindling rice supply. Autumn was bittersweet, beautiful and melancholic, the trees blazing with color before they shed their leaves and braced for the cold to come. Through it all, Yun Feng sat in his cave, meditating, chanting, sinking deeper and deeper into a state of mind that felt both utterly alien and profoundly right. He was not entirely alone. Every few months, a villager would make the climb to bring him rice or tea or news of the outside world, though Yun Feng rarely asked for the latter. These visitors were few and far between, and they treated him with a kind of reverent curiosity, as if he were a relic from another age. Some came seeking advice, hoping that his years of solitude had granted him wisdom or insight. Yun Feng rarely spoke more than a few words, and when he did, his voice was rough and halting, unused to the act of speech. He told them that he had no answers, only more questions, but they seemed to find comfort in his presence nonetheless. A monk from a nearby monastery visited once a year, bringing scriptures and engaging Yun Feng in long philosophical discussions that left both men exhausted and exhilarated. The monk marveled at Yun Feng's commitment, but also warned him of the dangers of too much isolation, the risk of losing touch not just with the world, but with reality itself. Yun Feng listened, but did not heed the warning. He felt more real in his cave than he had ever felt in the city, more connected to something essential and true. But the human mind is a strange and fragile thing, and 30 years is a long time to spend in a space barely larger than a prison cell, with only one's own thoughts for company. By the time 2020 arrived, Yun Feng was 62 years old, though he looked far older. His hair had gone completely white, his beard hung down to his chest in matted tangles, and his skin had taken on the texture of old leather, creased and weathered by decades of exposure to the elements. His body had withered, muscles atrophying from lack of use, his frame bent and fragile. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They were distant, unfocused, as if he were looking at something far beyond the physical world, something the rest of us could not see. And then, on a cold morning in early November, something happened that no one, least of all Yun Feng, could have anticipated. A small group of hikers, young urbanites from Beijing on a weekend adventure, stumbled upon his cave. They were not looking for him. They did not even know he existed. But when they saw him sitting at the entrance, his body wrapped in a ragged blanket, his lips moving in silent recitation, they stopped in their tracks, stunned and more than a little frightened. One of them, a woman in her 20s, called out a tentative greeting. Yun Feng did not respond. She called out again, louder this time, and slowly, as if waking from a dream that had lasted 3 decades, Yun Feng turned his head and looked at her. And in that moment, something inside him broke. The woman who had called out to Yun Feng would later describe the moment as one of the most unsettling experiences of her life. She said that when he turned to look at her, his eyes seemed to contain entire lifetimes, layers upon layers of experience compressed into a gaze that felt simultaneously empty and overwhelmingly full. He did not speak at first. He simply stared, his mouth hanging slightly open, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The other hikers hung back, uncertain whether to approach or retreat, their modern hiking gear and brightly colored backpacks seeming absurdly out of place against the ancient stone and the figure who looked like he had stepped out of a medieval scroll painting. One of the men in the group, a software engineer named Chen Wei, later told reporters that his first instinct was to assume they had stumbled upon a corpse. So still and pale was the figure at the cave entrance. It was only when Yun Feng blinked, slowly, deliberately, that Chen Wei realized they were looking at a living human being. The woman, whose name was Li Xiaomei, took a cautious step forward. She asked if he was all right, if he needed help, her voice gentle but laced with an edge of fear. Yun Feng's lips moved, forming shapes that might have been words, but no sound emerged. He tried again, his throat working, a rasping noise escaping that was more animal than human. Xiaomei pulled out her phone instinctively. not to call for help, but to document what she was seeing, though she would later delete the video out of respect for what followed. The other hikers began to crowd closer now, their initial fear giving way to a kind of morbid curiosity. They asked him how long he had been up here, where he had come from, if he knew what year it was. Yun Feng's face contorted with effort, and finally, in a voice like gravel scraping against stone, he managed a single word: help. It came out as a whisper, then again, louder, more desperate. Help me. And then, to everyone's shock, he began to weep, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, his entire body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal, a place that had been locked away for 30 years and was now breaking open all at once. The hikers did not know what to do. They were young, urban, accustomed to problems that could be solved with apps and internet searches, not this raw, unmediated human suffering. Chen Wei pulled out his own phone and, finding that he had a weak signal at this altitude, called the local authorities. Within hours, a rescue team was dispatched, though the term rescue seemed inadequate for what was unfolding. When the team arrived, they found Yun Feng curled on the ground just inside the cave entrance, his body trembling uncontrollably, muttering phrases in a dialect so thick and archaic that even the local team members had trouble understanding him. He kept repeating something that sounded like "take me back, lock me in," over and over as if it were a mantra. The team leader, a man named Zhang Qiang, who had conducted dozens of mountain rescues, later said he had never encountered anything quite like it. They tried to calm Yun Feng, to explain that they were there to help, but he recoiled from their touch as if it burned him, his eyes wide with something that looked less like fear and more like existential horror. It took them nearly an hour to coax him out of the cave. They wrapped him in thermal blankets, gave him water and a protein bar, which he refused, and slowly guided him down the mountain path. Yun Feng moved like a man in a trance, his steps unsteady, his gaze fixed on the ground. Every so often he would stop and turn back toward the cave, his face contorted with anguish, and the rescuers would have to gently urge him forward. The descent, which had taken the hikers a brisk 90 minutes on their way up, took nearly 4 hours with Yun Feng. When they finally reached the base of the mountain where an ambulance was waiting, a small crowd had gathered, villagers and curious onlookers who had heard rumors of the hermit being brought down. Someone in the crowd gasped when they saw him, and an elderly woman began to cry, though no one was quite sure why. Yun Feng was loaded into the ambulance, still muttering, still weeping, his hands clutching at the blanket as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had become incomprehensible. The hospital in the nearest town was a modest facility, not equipped for the kind of case that was about to walk through its doors. The doctors who examined Yun Feng were baffled by what they found. Physically, he was malnourished and dehydrated, his muscles severely atrophied, his teeth in advanced stages of decay, his skin riddled with lesions and fungal infections from years of exposure and poor hygiene. These were problems they understood, conditions they could treat with IV fluids and antibiotics and time. But it was his mental state that defied easy diagnosis. He was lucid, in the sense that he could answer basic questions about who he was and where he had been, though his answers were slow and halting, as if he were translating from some internal language that did not quite map onto Mandarin. But he was also profoundly disoriented, unable to grasp basic concepts that should have been second nature. When a nurse tried to take his blood pressure with an electronic monitor, he flinched away from the device as if it were a weapon. When the lights in his room flickered on automatically as evening fell, he let out a strangled cry and covered his eyes. The sound of a television in the hallway sent him into a panic attack so severe that they had to sedate him. Dr. Lin Hao, a psychiatrist brought in to consult on the case, spent hours with Yun Feng over the following days, trying to piece together not just what had happened, but why Yun Feng was reacting the way he was. What emerged was a picture of a man who had not simply lived in isolation, but had fundamentally rewired his consciousness to exist in a reality so different from the one he had returned to that the re-entry was nothing short of traumatic. Yun Feng described his years in the cave in language that sounded almost mystical. He spoke of time as a river that he had learned to step out of thoughts as physical objects that he could hold and examine and release. He said that in the silence he had found a kind of peace so profound that the very idea of returning to the world of noise and motion and other people had seemed not just undesirable but impossible, a violation of some fundamental truth he had discovered. And yet, when the hikers had appeared, when they had spoken to him, something had shifted. The wall he had built between himself and the world had cracked, and all the things he had been hiding from for 30 years had come flooding back in. But what haunted Dr. Lin, what kept him awake at night reviewing his notes, was what Yun Feng said when asked why he had begged to be locked back in the cave. Yun Feng had looked at him with those distant, ancient eyes and said that the world outside was too loud, too bright, too fast, too full of things that did not matter. He said that every sound was like a knife cutting into his brain, every interaction of violence against the self he had so carefully cultivated. He said that he could feel the cave calling to him, that even now, lying in a hospital bed surrounded by machines and nurses and doctors, he could hear the silence of the mountain like a song in the back of his mind, and that it was the only thing that made sense anymore. Dr. Lin asked if he understood that going back might mean never leaving again, that his body could not sustain another 30 years in those conditions. Yun Feng nodded slowly and said that he understood, and that it did not matter, because the person who had walked into that cave in 1990 had died long ago, and the person lying in this hospital bed was just a ghost trying to find his way home. News of the hermit who begged to be locked back in his cave spread quickly, first through local channels and then, inevitably, to national and international media. The story had all the elements of a modern parable, a man who had rejected the material world, who had sought enlightenment in absolute solitude, only to find that the return to civilization was more unbearable than the isolation itself. Journalists descended on the hospital, though they were kept at bay by administrators who cited patient privacy. But that did not stop the speculation, the think pieces, the social media debates about what Yun Feng's experience meant in an age of constant connectivity and digital overload. Some saw him as a cautionary tale, evidence of what happens when you take the pursuit of inner peace to an extreme. Others saw him as a kind of prophet, a man who had glimpsed a truth that the rest of us were too distracted to see. Still others dismissed the whole thing as mental illness, a breakdown that could have been prevented with proper intervention decades earlier. Yun Feng's family, who had long ago given up hope of ever seeing him again, were contacted and made the journey to the hospital. The reunion was not the tearful, joyful moment one might expect from a television drama. His mother, now in her 80s and confined to a wheelchair, stared at the skeletal figure in the hospital bed and struggled to reconcile him with the son she remembered. His father had passed away 10 years earlier, and his sisters, both now middle-aged women with families of their own, approached him with a mixture of relief and unease. They tried to talk to him about the past, about shared memories, about the life he had left behind. But Yun Feng responded as if they were speaking about someone else entirely, a character from a story he had once heard but could no longer quite recall. When his younger sister Yun Mei began to cry and asked him why he had done this to them, why he had abandoned them without a word, he looked at her with an expression that was almost pitying and said that the person she was mourning had never really existed, that he had been a fiction they had all agreed to believe in, and that the cave had simply allowed him to stop pretending. The doctors were unsure how to proceed. Legally, Yun Feng was not a prisoner, and he was not deemed a danger to himself or others in the immediate sense, so they could not force him to stay. But releasing him back to the mountain seemed unconscionable, tantamount to assisted suicide. Dr. Lin proposed a compromise, a period of gradual reintegration, moving Yun Feng to a quieter facility, perhaps a monastery or a rural retreat where he could adjust to the presence of others without the overwhelming stimuli of modern life. Yun Feng agreed to this, though his agreement seemed more like resignation than genuine consent. He was transferred to a Buddhist monastery about 50 miles from the hospital, a place that had a long history of taking in lost souls and offering them sanctuary. The monks there were accustomed to silence, to simplicity, to lives governed by ritual and meditation. It seemed, on paper at least, like the perfect environment for someone like Yun Feng. But the monastery, for all its tranquility, was still a world away from the absolute solitude of the cave. There were other monks, perhaps a dozen of them, who moved through the halls in quiet reverence, but whose very presence was a constant reminder to Yun Feng that he was no longer alone. There were meals taken in communal silence, prayers chanted in unison, chores performed in rotating shifts. Yun Feng participated in these rituals mechanically, his body going through the motions, while his mind seemed to be somewhere else entirely, somewhere far away. The head monk, a man named Master Jing, who had spent 40 years in monastic life, tried to engage Yun Feng in conversation, to understand what he had experienced and what he was searching for. But Yun Feng was reluctant to talk. When he did speak, it was in fragments, incomplete thoughts that trailed off into silence. He said that the monastery was too full, even with its vows of silence, that he could feel the thoughts and emotions of the other monks pressing in on him like a physical weight. He said that he had learned to exist without the self, but that being around other people forced him to reconstruct it, and that the reconstruction was agony. Master Jing, who considered himself a man of deep compassion and understanding, found himself at a loss. He consulted with Dr. Lin, who visited once a week to check on Yun Feng's progress, and together they tried to develop a plan. But Yun Feng was deteriorating, not physically but in some more fundamental way. He stopped eating again, claiming that food tasted wrong, that his body rejected it. He stopped sleeping, spending his nights sitting in the monastery garden, staring up at the sky with an intensity that unnerved the younger monks. And he started talking about the cave again, not with the anguish he had shown in the hospital, but with a kind of longing, a desperate homesickness for a place that most people would consider a hell. He told Master Jing that he had made a mistake leaving, that the hikers had broken something that could not be repaired, and that every moment he spent in this world was a moment of suffering that served no purpose. And then, late one night, 3 weeks after his arrival at the monastery, Yun Feng disappeared. The discovery of Yun Feng's absence came with the morning bell, the deep bronze tone that called the monks to their first meditation of the day. When he did not appear in the hall, one of the younger monks was sent to check his room, a small chamber with a single window that overlooked the bamboo grove. The room was empty. The bed had not been slept in, or perhaps it had been made with such meticulous care that it was impossible to tell. The few possessions Yun Feng had been given, a change of clothes, a toothbrush, a copy of the Diamond Sutra, were arranged neatly on the shelf as if he had prepared for an inspection. But Yun Feng himself was gone. Master Jing was notified immediately, and a search of the monastery grounds began. The monks fanning out across the courtyards and gardens, calling his name in voices that echoed off the ancient stone walls. They found him 2 hours later, not hiding but walking steadily along the mountain road that led back toward the Zhongnan range, his bare feet bleeding from the rough stones, his face set with a determination that bordered on ecstasy. When they caught up to him, Yun Feng did not resist. He did not argue or plead. He simply stopped walking and stood there, swaying slightly, as if he were a compass needle that had finally found true north and was waiting for the world to acknowledge it. Master Jing, who had rushed out in his robes and sandals, approached with both hands raised in a gesture of peace and asked Yun Feng where he was going. The answer came without hesitation, without emotion, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Home, Yun Feng said. I am going home. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that none of the monks wanted to fully examine. Master Jing gently explained that the monastery was meant to be his home now, at least for the time being, that they were trying to help him, that going back to the cave in his condition would be suicide. Yun Feng listened with the patience of someone waiting for a child to finish a tantrum, and then he shook his head slowly and said that Master Jing did not understand, that no one understood, that the cave was not a place of death, but the only place where he had ever truly been alive. They brought him back to the monastery, and this time, Master Jing made the difficult decision to confine him to his room, not as a punishment, but as a precaution. A monk was stationed outside the door at all times, ostensibly to provide assistance if needed, but in reality to ensure Yun Feng did not attempt another escape. Dr. Lin was called again, and he arrived the next day with a colleague, a neurologist named Dr. Fang Shumin, who specialized in cases of extreme sensory deprivation and its effects on brain function. Together, they conducted a battery of tests, some physical and some psychological, trying to map the contours of what had happened to Yun Feng's mind during those 30 years in isolation. What they found was both fascinating and deeply troubling. A case study that would eventually be written up in medical journals and debated in academic circles for years to come. The physical examinations revealed that Yun Feng's brain had undergone measurable changes, alterations that could be seen on the MRI scans Dr. Fang ordered. The most striking was a reduction in the size of the hippocampus, the region associated with memory formation and spatial navigation, which had atrophied to a degree typically seen in patients with advanced Alzheimer's disease. Yet Yun Feng's memory, at least for events from his time in the cave, seemed sharp, almost preternaturally so. He could describe individual days from years ago with vivid detail. The way the light had fallen on a particular afternoon, the sound of rain on stone, the texture of a specific piece of dried mushroom he had eaten for breakfast on a morning he identified as being in his 15th year of isolation. But his memory of life before the cave was fragmentary, dissolving like a photograph left too long in the sun. He could not remember his father's face clearly. He could not recall the layout of the apartment where he had grown up. When shown a photograph of himself from his 20s, a formal portrait taken for his work identification, he stared at it for a long moment, and then said quietly that the person in the picture was a stranger. Dr. Fang hypothesized that what they were seeing was a form of profound neuroplasticity, the brain adapting to an environment so radically different from anything it had evolved to handle that it had essentially rebuilt itself around new parameters. In the absence of external stimuli, in the absence of social interaction and the constant flood of information that characterizes modern life, Yun Feng's brain had pruned away the neural pathways associated with those functions and reinforced the ones associated with internal awareness, with self-monitoring, with the kind of intense introspection that borders on the pathological. Dr. Lin added that what made Yun Feng's case particularly unusual was the element of volition. This was not someone who had been imprisoned against his will, not a hostage or a prisoner of war suffering from the trauma of captivity. Yun Feng had chosen this, had sought it out, and had maintained that choice for 3 decades. The question that haunted both doctors was whether what they were witnessing was enlightenment or madness, and whether, in fact, there was any meaningful difference between the two when pushed to such extremes. The psychological evaluations were even more perplexing. Standard diagnostic tools seemed inadequate to capture what Yun Feng was experiencing. When asked to describe his emotional state, he struggled with the vocabulary, saying that terms like happiness or sadness felt crude and imprecise, like trying to describe a symphony using only the words loud and quiet. He said that in the cave, he had experienced states of being that had no names, moments of clarity so intense that they felt like physical sensations, and stretches of darkness so profound that they erased the boundary between sleep and waking. Dr. Lin asked if he had experienced hallucinations, and Yun Feng paused for a long time before answering. He said that the word hallucination implied a distinction between real and unreal that he no longer found useful, that in the silence visions had come to him, voices had spoken, but that calling them unreal was like calling a dream unreal, technically accurate, but missing the point. He described seeing geometric patterns that seemed to underlie the structure of reality itself, colors that did not exist in the normal spectrum, entities that might have been ancestors or bodhisattvas, or simply fragments of his own mind given form. But what troubled the doctors most was Yun Feng's complete lack of desire to reintegrate into society. In cases of extreme isolation, whether voluntary or involuntary, there is usually a period of disorientation followed by a gradual, if difficult, readjustment to normal life. Hostages eventually go home. Prisoners eventually rejoin their families. Even monks who have spent years in retreat eventually return to their communities. But Yun Feng showed no signs of wanting to readjust. If anything, his distress seemed to be increasing the longer he remained in the world of people and noise and light. He complained of sensory overload, describing the experience of being in a room with other people as like being assaulted by 1,000 different radio signals all broadcasting at once, each one demanding attention, each one fragmenting his consciousness. He said that in the cave, he had achieved a state of unity, a kind of seamless integration of self and environment that felt natural and right, and that being forced to maintain a separate self in relation to other separate selves was like being torn apart at the seams. Dr. Lin conducted extensive interviews with people who had known Yun Feng before his retreat, trying to understand whether there had been warning signs, predisposing factors that might explain why he had been drawn to such an extreme path. His mother, frail but still sharp of mind, described him as a sensitive child, easily overwhelmed by crowds and loud noises, someone who sought out quiet corners and spent hours alone with his thoughts. His sisters remembered him as kind but distant, always seeming slightly apart from the family even when physically present. A former co-worker from the factory recalled that Yun Feng had once said, during a rare moment of candor over lunch, that he felt like he was living in a play where everyone else knew their lines, but he was constantly improvising, never quite getting it right. These recollections painted a picture of someone who had always struggled with the fundamental act of being in the world with others, for whom social existence was not a natural state, but a performance that required constant, exhausting effort. But there were also anomalies in Yun Feng's story. Details that did not quite add up and that began to nag at Dr. Fang as he reviewed his notes. For one thing, Yun Feng's physical condition, while certainly deteriorated, was not as catastrophic as it should have been for someone who had spent 30 years in near total isolation with minimal nutrition and no medical care. Most of his teeth were bad, yes, but some were intact. His bones showed signs of calcium deficiency, but not the severe osteoporosis one would expect. His muscles had atrophied, but he could still walk, still move, still perform basic tasks. Dr. Fang began to suspect that Yun Feng's account of his time in the cave, while perhaps emotionally true, might not be factually complete. He raised this with Dr. Lin, who was initially defensive, having invested considerable time and emotional energy in trying to understand and help Yun Feng. But as they discussed it further, other inconsistencies emerged. Yun Feng's detailed memories of specific days in the cave seemed almost too vivid, too cinematically perfect, as if they had been constructed or at least heavily edited in retrospect. And there was the matter of the hikers who had found him. Dr. Fang requested copies of the statements the hikers had given to the authorities, and he read them with growing unease. According to their accounts, when they had first approached the cave, they had seen what appeared to be recent signs of activity. A small fire pit with ashes that looked only a few days old, scraps of modern packaging, a plastic water bottle. These details had not made it into the initial reports, dismissed as likely belonging to other hikers who had used the cave as a temporary shelter. But Dr. Fang wondered if there was another explanation. He arranged to speak with Chen Wei, the software engineer from the hiking group, who confirmed that yes, there had definitely been trash in and around the cave, things that looked distinctly contemporary. Chen Wei said he had assumed someone else had left it there, that Yun Feng was just one of several people who used the cave. But when pressed, he admitted that the timeline did not quite work, that the ashes in the fire pit had been warm to the touch, that the water bottle had been nearly full. This discovery led to a broader investigation into the network of caves in the Zhongnan Mountains and the hermit community that supposedly inhabited them. What Dr. Fang found was that the romantic image of solitary mystics meditating in absolute isolation was not entirely accurate, or at least not anymore. By the 21st century, the hermit tradition had become something of a cottage industry, with villagers from the base of the mountain making regular trips to deliver supplies in exchange for small donations from visitors who came seeking blessings or wisdom. Some hermits had even set up crude shops selling incense and prayer beads to tourists who had heard of the caves through social media. The idea of someone spending 30 years in complete unbroken solitude without any contact with the outside world was, Dr. Fang realized, almost certainly a myth, which raised the question, what had Yun Feng actually been doing all those years? And why was he now so desperate to maintain the fiction of absolute isolation? Dr. Lin was reluctant to confront Yun Feng directly with these inconsistencies, fearing it might trigger another crisis or even a violent reaction. But he did begin to probe more carefully during their sessions, asking Yun Feng to describe specific aspects of his daily life in the cave, looking for contradictions or gaps. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the story began to change. Yun Feng admitted, when pushed, that yes, villagers had come occasionally, though he insisted it was rare, perhaps once or twice a year. Then it became once or twice a season, then monthly. He acknowledged that he had sometimes accepted gifts of rice or tea, but claimed he had never asked for them, that they had been left at the cave entrance like offerings. When Dr. Lin asked about the plastic water bottle, Yun Feng became agitated, his voice rising, insisting that someone else must have left it, that he had never used such things, that even the suggestion was an insult to the purity of his practice. But the agitation itself was telling, a crack in the carefully constructed narrative that Yun Feng had built around his experience. What emerged from these sessions was a more complex and, in some ways, more tragic picture than the simple story of a hermit seeking enlightenment. Yun Feng had indeed spent the majority of 3 decades in that cave, but his isolation had not been as absolute as he claimed, or perhaps even as he remembered it. There had been contact with the outside world, irregular and minimal but real. There had been moments when he had considered leaving, had even descended partway down the mountain before turning back. There had been periods of doubt, of loneliness so crushing that he had wept for days, of fear that he had made a terrible mistake and wasted his life. But over time, these doubts and fears had been integrated into a larger narrative, a story he told himself about what his retreat meant, about the spiritual significance of his suffering. And when the hikers had appeared and shattered that narrative by forcing him back into the world, the carefully maintained structure of meaning had collapsed, leaving him with nothing but the raw, unprocessed reality of what he had done and what it had cost him. Dr. Fang wrote in his notes that what they were dealing with was not simply the effects of sensory deprivation, but something closer to a dissociative disorder. A fracturing of identity that had allowed Yun Feng to split his experience into compartments that did not communicate with each other. There was the Yun Feng who had sought enlightenment and found it, who had transcended the self and merged with the absolute. And there was the Yun Feng who had sat alone in a freezing cave for 30 years, hungry and frightened and desperately clinging to a belief system that gave his suffering meaning. Both versions were real. Both were true in their own way, but they could not coexist in the same conscious awareness without one destroying the other. The return to the world had forced a confrontation between these two selves, and the result was the psychological collapse they were now witnessing. The question now was whether it was possible to integrate these fractured pieces into something whole, or whether Yun Feng was too far gone, too deeply invested in the fiction of his own enlightenment to ever fully return. But even as the doctors worked to unravel the psychological puzzle of Yun Feng's case, another mystery was emerging, one that would prove far more disturbing, and that would ultimately call into question everything they thought they understood about what had happened in that cave. It began with a phone call to the hospital from a journalist, a woman named Wu Lan, who worked for an investigative news program and who had been following the story of the hermit. Wu Lan said she had been doing her own research into the caves and had discovered something that the doctors needed to know. She had found records, old police reports from the early 2000s, about another hermit who had lived in the same cave system. This hermit, a man whose name had been lost to time, had also been brought down from the mountains after concerned villagers reported that he had not been seen in months. When authorities reached his cave, they found evidence of a struggle, blood on the walls, and signs that something violent had occurred. The hermit himself was never found, and the case had been closed as a probable accidental death, the body assumed to have been carried off by animals or fallen into one of the deep ravines that scarred the mountainside. Hulan asked the doctors if they thought there might be a connection, if perhaps Yun Feng knew more about what had happened to that earlier hermit than he was saying. Dr. Lin dismissed the idea initially, seeing it as the kind of sensationalist speculation that journalists love, but that rarely leads anywhere productive. But the question planted a seed, and that night, as he reviewed his notes from his sessions with Yun Feng, something caught his attention. In one of their conversations, when Yun Feng had been describing the visions he experienced in the cave, he had mentioned seeing a figure, another man, who appeared to him in the darkness and spoke in a language Yun Feng could not understand. At the time, Dr. Lin had interpreted this as a hallucination, a manifestation of loneliness given form. But now he wondered if there might be another explanation, a darker and more literal one, hiding in plain sight within Yun Feng's fractured account of his years in the mountain's cold embrace. Dr. Lin sat in his office late that night, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, a cup of tea growing cold on his desk as he combed through transcripts of every conversation he had ever had with Yun Feng. The journalist's question had opened a door in his mind that he could not close, and now he was searching for the key that would unlock what lay behind it. He found the passage he was looking for in notes from their 4th session, a rambling monologue Yun Feng had delivered while staring out the window at the monastery garden. Yun Feng had said that in his 7th year in the cave, or perhaps his 8th, time had become fluid by then. He had woken one morning to find that he was not alone. There was a presence, he had said, a weight in the darkness that had not been there before. At first he had thought it was an animal, perhaps a wild dog or a leopard seeking shelter, and he had remained perfectly still, barely breathing, waiting for it to leave. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized it was a man, sitting cross-legged in the corner of the cave, mirroring Yun Feng's own posture, silent and motionless. Yun Feng had described the encounter in language that Dr. Lin had interpreted as metaphorical, the kind of archetypal imagery that emerges from deep meditative states. He had said the figure was both present and absent, both solid and transparent, that it seemed to be made of the same substance as the cave itself, as if the stone had decided to dream itself into human form. The figure had not spoken, at least not in words, but Yun Feng claimed he had understood its message nonetheless, a communication that happened beneath language, in the realm of pure meaning. The message, as Yun Feng recounted it, was a warning and an invitation. The cave belonged to those who surrendered themselves completely, who were willing to dissolve the boundaries of self until nothing remained but awareness itself. Those who came seeking but were not ready, who clung to their identities and their fears, would be consumed by the darkness, would become part of the mountain's eternal silence in a way that was not peaceful, but terrifying. Dr. Lin had written in his notes at the time that this vision represented Yun Feng's own doubts externalized, his fear that he had gone too far and would not be able to find his way back. But now, reading it again through the lens of Wu Lan's revelation about the missing hermit, another interpretation suggested itself, one that made his skin prickle with unease. What if the figure had not been a vision at all? What if Yun Feng, in his isolated and deteriorating mental state, had encountered another person in that cave system, perhaps the very hermit who had disappeared? What if something had happened between them, something that Yun Feng's mind had transformed into mystical experience to avoid confronting the reality of it? Dr. Lin reached for his phone and called Wu Lan, despite the late hour. When she answered, her voice alert and expectant as if she had been waiting for this call, he asked her to send him everything she had on the missing hermit case, every detail, every report, every scrap of evidence. The files arrived by email within the hour, scanned documents that were grainy and difficult to read, but chilling in their implications. The missing hermit had been identified after the fact as a man named Huang Deshi, 53 years old at the time of his disappearance, a former construction worker from Gansu Province who had come to the mountains seeking spiritual refuge after a series of personal tragedies, the loss of his wife and daughter in a bus accident. He had been living in the caves for approximately 3 years before his disappearance, and according to the villagers who had known him, he had been a gentle soul, troubled and grieving but not dangerous. The police report noted that his cave, located about half a mile from where Yun Feng had been found, showed signs of disturbance. A sleeping mat had been torn. There were dark stains on the stone floor that tested positive for human blood, and scratches on the wall that suggested a struggle, or perhaps someone clawing desperately at the rock. But there was no body, no conclusive evidence of foul play, and with no family pressing for answers and no witnesses, the case had simply faded away, absorbed into the vast catalogue of unsolved mysteries that accumulate in remote regions where official oversight is minimal. Dr. Lin studied the photographs from the scene, blown up on his computer screen until the pixels became visible. The cave in the images looked similar to Yun Feng's. The same rough stone walls, the same narrow entrance, the same sense of oppressive confinement. The blood stains were concentrated near what appeared to be a fire pit, and there were drag marks leading toward the back of the cave, where the floor sloped down into darkness. One photograph showed a close-up of the scratches on the wall, and Dr. Lin felt his breath catch. They were not random. They formed characters, crude and barely legible but unmistakably writing. He zoomed in further, trying to make out what they said, and slowly the words resolved themselves into a phrase that sent a chill down his spine. Do not trust the silence. It hungers. The next morning, Dr. Lin drove back to the monastery, his mind racing with possibilities he did not want to entertain. He found Yun Feng in the garden, sitting on a stone bench beneath a gnarled plum tree, his eyes closed, his face turned toward the sun. For a moment, Dr. Lin simply watched him, this skeletal figure who seemed caught between worlds, and he felt a wave of compassion, mixed with something darker, something closer to dread. He sat down beside Yun Feng without speaking, and they remained that way for several minutes, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. Finally, Dr. Lin broke the silence. He asked Yun Feng to tell him again about the figure he had seen in the cave, the man who had appeared in his 7th or 8th year. Yun Feng opened his eyes slowly, and Dr. Lin could see immediately that something had changed in his expression, a wariness that had not been there before. Yun Feng said that he had told Dr. Lin everything, that there was nothing more to say. Dr. Lin persisted, asking for more details, more specifics. What had the figure looked like? What had he been wearing? Had he seemed real, solid, or had he been transparent like a ghost? Yun Feng's jaw tightened, and he turned away, staring at the garden as if he could find answers in the arrangement of rocks and moss. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He said that the figure had been real as Dr. Lin sitting beside him now, and that yes, there had been interactions, conversations that happened in the long silences between one breath and the next. He said the man had been ill, both in body and in mind, consumed by grief for losses that could not be undone, and that he had come to the cave seeking the same thing Yun Feng sought, an end to suffering, a dissolution of the self that carried so much pain. Dr. Lin felt his pulse quicken. He asked what had happened to this man, where he had gone. Yun Feng was silent for a long time, so long that Dr. Lin began to think he would not answer at all. When he did speak, the words came out slowly, carefully, as if each one had to be weighed before being released into the world. Yun Feng said that the man had found what he was looking for, that he had achieved the dissolution he craved, but not in the way he had hoped. He said that one night, during a particularly harsh winter storm, when the temperature inside the cave dropped to near freezing and the wind howled like a living thing, the man had stopped breathing. Yun Feng had sat with the body through the night, watching as the warmth left it, as the skin grew pale and waxen. And he had understood in that moment that this was what happened to those who sought annihilation, but were not spiritually prepared for it. The body became an empty shell, and what had animated it simply dispersed into the void. Dr. Lin's hands were trembling. He asked Yun Feng what he had done with the body. The answer came without hesitation, without any apparent awareness of how disturbing it was. Yun Feng said he had dragged it to the back of the cave, where the floor gave way to a deep crevasse, a natural shaft that descended into the mountain's heart, and he had committed it to the darkness, a burial that seemed appropriate for someone who had sought to merge with the void. He said he had spoken the Heart Sutra over the edge, his voice echoing in the depths, and then he had returned to his meditation as if nothing had happened, because in the grand scheme of things, in the context of the truths he was pursuing, one man's death was no more significant than the falling of a leaf. Dr. Lin felt the world tilt slightly, the implications of what he was hearing crashing over him in waves. He asked, as calmly as he could manage, whether Yun Feng had considered reporting this, whether it had occurred to him that the authorities might need to know, that the man might have had family who deserved to know what had happened. Yun Feng looked at him with an expression that was almost confused, as if the question did not make sense in the framework he inhabited. He said that the world of laws and authorities and family obligations was the world he had left behind, that in the cave different rules applied, the rules of nature and spirit and the dissolution of attachment. A man had died, yes, but death was just another transition, another shedding of form, and to treat it as a tragedy or a crime was to miss the point entirely. But there was something else in Yun Feng's account, something that made Dr. Lin's professional skepticism flare even as his horror deepened. He asked Yun Feng to describe the man's appearance, his age, any identifying details. Yun Feng described someone who sounded very much like Huang Daishi, the missing hermit from the police reports, the same age range, the same background of loss and seeking. But when Dr. Lin mentioned the name, Yun Feng claimed not to recognize it, said that the man had never given his name, that names were meaningless in the cave, just more attachments to be released. Dr. Lin pressed harder, asking about the blood on the cave floor, the signs of struggle that the police had found. Yun Feng's face darkened, and for the first time in all their conversations, Dr. Lin saw something that looked like anger, or perhaps fear, flash across those ancient eyes. Yun Feng said that Dr. Lin did not understand, that he was trying to impose a narrative of violence and crime onto something that transcended such categories. He said that yes, there had been blood, because the man had been sick, coughing and spitting and bleeding from somewhere inside. And yes, there had been disturbance, because in his final hours, the man had thrashed and clawed at the walls in terror, not of Yun Feng, but of what he was seeing, the visions that come to those who approach death without proper preparation. Yun Feng said he had tried to comfort him, had held his hand and spoken sutras, but that ultimately each person must face their own dissolution alone. And this man had faced his badly, with fear instead of acceptance. And when it was over, when the body lay still and the spirit had departed, Yun Feng had done what he thought was right, what the cave itself seemed to demand. He had given the body back to the mountain. Dr. Lin excused himself and walked quickly to the monastery's office, where he asked to use the phone. He called the local police and, after being transferred several times, reached a detective who was familiar with the old missing person case. Dr. Lin explained what Yun Feng had told him, carefully, clinically, trying to present it as information that needed investigation rather than an accusation of wrongdoing. The detective listened in silence, and when Dr. Lin finished, there was a long pause. Then the detective said that they would need to send a team back to the caves to try to locate this crevasse Yun Feng had described, to see if there was any evidence to corroborate the story. He said it would be difficult, that the cave system was extensive and poorly mapped, that recovery of remains after so many years might be impossible, but that they would try. He asked if Yun Feng could be persuaded to guide them, to show them exactly where he had disposed of the body. Dr. Lin said he would ask, though he suspected what the answer would be. When Dr. Lin returned to the garden, Yun Feng was gone. Master Jing found him 20 minutes later, back in his room, sitting in the corner with his knees drawn to his chest, rocking slightly, muttering in a language that was not quite Mandarin and not quite anything else. A stream of syllables that sounded ancient and terrible. They could not calm him, could not reach him through whatever wall he had erected around himself. Dr. Lin administered a mild sedative, and eventually Yun Feng slept. But even in sleep, he was not at peace. His body twitching, his lips moving in silent conversation with something only he could see. Dr. Lin sat beside the bed and wrote in his notebook, trying to make sense of what he had learned, trying to separate fact from delusion, trying to determine whether Yun Feng was a man who had witnessed a death and failed to report it, or whether something darker had occurred in that cave. Something that Yun Feng's shattered mind had rewritten into a narrative of spiritual necessity. The police investigation, when it finally got underway, was hampered by every obstacle imaginable. The caves were remote, accessible only by treacherous trails that were dangerous even for experienced climbers. The weather was turning cold, with early snow already dusting the higher elevations. And without Yun Feng's cooperation, locating the specific crevasse he had described was like searching for a particular grain of sand on a beach. The team spent 3 days in the mountains, exploring caves, rappelling into fissures, finding nothing but old fire pits and scattered debris from decades of hermits passing through. They did locate what they believed was Huang Deshi's original cave, and they confirmed that it matched the crime scene photos from years earlier, but any evidence that might have existed had long since been degraded by time and weather and the small animals that made the caves their home. On the 4th day, one of the team members, a young officer named Liu Wei, found something that made him call for the others. In a cave approximately 300 meters from where Yun Feng had been discovered, there was a narrow passage at the back that led to a vertical shaft, just as Yun Feng had described. Liu Wei had dropped a flare down the shaft, watching it fall for what seemed like an impossible distance before it landed with a faint splash in what might have been water or might have been something else. The team discussed whether to attempt a descent, but the consensus was that it was too dangerous, that they would need specialized equipment and experienced cave rescue personnel, and that even then, the chances of finding anything after so many years were minimal. The investigation was effectively suspended, pending further resources that everyone knew would never materialize. Huang Deshi's case remained unsolved, and Yun Feng's account remained unverified, existing in that liminal space between confession and delusion. But the revelation had done something to Yun Feng, had broken something that could not be repaired. He stopped speaking almost entirely, responding to questions with single words or not at all. He stopped eating again, refusing meals with a gentle but firm shake of his head, his body continuing its slow dissolution. Dr. Lin brought in other specialists, psychiatrists who had dealt with trauma and dissociative disorders, but none of them could reach the place where Yun Feng had retreated. Master Jing spent hours sitting with him in silence, a companionship of non-communication that seemed to be the only thing Yun Feng could tolerate. And through it all, Yun Feng's eyes remained fixed on something distant and invisible, something that might have been the cave or might have been the abyss he had spent 30 years staring into, until it had finally stared back. Winter came early that year to the Zhongnan Mountains, arriving with a ferocity that caught even the locals by surprise. Snow fell in thick, silent curtains, transforming the landscape into something primordial and unforgiving, burying the trails that led to the caves under drifts that would not melt until spring. At the monastery, the monks prepared for the season as they had for centuries, stockpiling firewood and rice, checking the integrity of roofs and windows, settling into the long, contemplative months when the outside world became inaccessible, and the only reality was the one contained within the monastery walls. For Yun Feng, the approaching isolation should have been a comfort, a return to the conditions he claimed to crave. But instead, it seemed to deepen his distress, as if he understood on some instinctive level that this confinement was fundamentally different from the one he had chosen. that being locked in by circumstance was not the same as locking oneself in by will. Dr. Lin made one final visit before the roads became impassable, driving through a snowstorm that reduced visibility to nearly nothing, his car sliding on ice as he navigated the mountain switchbacks. He found Yun Feng in his room, wrapped in blankets, staring at the window where frost had created elaborate crystalline patterns on the glass. Dr. Lin pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down heavily, exhausted not just from the drive, but from the weight of everything that had transpired. He had spent weeks writing his report, a document that would be read by medical professionals and legal authorities, and would ultimately determine how Yun Feng's case was classified and what, if anything, would happen next. But before he submitted it, he needed to understand one more thing. He needed to know if Yun Feng felt any remorse, any guilt for what had happened to Huang Daishi. Assuming the story was true, and not another layer of delusion. Yun Feng turned his head slowly, acknowledging Dr. Lin's presence with the faintest movement. Dr. Lin asked the question as gently as he could, framing it not as an accusation, but as an inquiry into Yun Feng's emotional state. Did he regret not reporting the death? Did he understand why others might see his actions as morally wrong, even if he did not? Yun Feng's response, when it finally came, was delivered in a voice so quiet that Dr. Lin had to lean forward to hear it. He said that regret implied a belief that things could have been otherwise, that different choices could have led to different outcomes, but that he no longer believed in that kind of causality. Everything that happened in the cave had been inevitable, a working out of karmic patterns that stretched back far beyond the lives of the individuals involved. Huang Daishi had come to the mountain to die, whether he knew it consciously or not, and Yun Feng had been there to witness it, to perform the small rituals that eased the transition. To feel guilt about it would be like feeling guilt about the seasons changing or the sun setting. Dr. Lin felt a profound sadness listening to this. A sadness not just for Yun Feng, but for the unbridgeable gap between them, between Yun Feng's worldview and the one that governed the society he had been forced back into. Dr. Lin asked if Yun Feng understood that other people who had loved Huang Daishi, might have wanted to know what happened to him, might have wanted to bury him properly, to grieve. Yun Feng nodded slowly, and for a moment, something that looked almost like pain crossed his face. He said he understood that intellectually, that he could remember a time when he would have felt those things himself, but that the person who could feel them had died long ago in the cave, and the person who remained was someone else entirely, someone who operated according to different laws. He said it was like trying to explain color to someone born blind, or music to someone born deaf. The concepts existed, he could acknowledge them, but they had no emotional resonance. No weight. Dr. Lin sat back in his chair, feeling defeated. He asked one final question, the one that had been haunting him since the beginning. If Yun Feng could go back in time, knowing everything that would happen, would he still walk into that cave in 1990? Would he still choose 30 years of isolation, the deterioration of his body and mind, the loss of his family, the death of Huang Daishi, the agony of his forced return? Yun Feng did not hesitate. Yes, he said, 1,000 times yes. Because in that cave, for brief shining moments that might have lasted seconds or hours or days, he had touched something that most people never even knew existed, a state of being so pure and clear and absolute that everything else, all the suffering and loneliness and loss, was worth it. He said it was like asking someone who had seen the face of God if they would give up that vision to avoid the pain it cost them. The answer would always be no, because once you have seen it, once you have known it, everything else becomes a shadow. Dr. Lin left the monastery that afternoon as the snow continued to fall, and he did not return. His report, when it was finally submitted, was a masterpiece of clinical detachment, laying out the facts as he understood them, the medical findings, the psychological assessments, the unresolved questions about Huang Daishi's death. He concluded that Yun Feng was experiencing a severe dissociative disorder, complicated by the physical and neurological effects of prolonged isolation, that his reality testing was profoundly impaired, and that he represented neither a danger to others nor someone who could be reasonably expected to reintegrate into normal society. The recommendation was for continued psychiatric care in a supervised setting, with the understanding that full recovery was unlikely. The legal authorities reviewed the case and determined that there was insufficient evidence to bring charges related to Huang Deshi's death, that even if Yun Feng's account was accurate, it described a failure to report rather than a criminal act, and that prosecuting a man in his condition would serve no purpose. The case was closed, filed away in archives where it would gather dust alongside thousands of other human mysteries that defy easy resolution. But the story did not end there, because stories like this never really end. They ripple outward, touching lives in ways both obvious and subtle, becoming part of the cultural conversation, the collective attempt to make meaning out of the inexplicable. Wu Lan, the journalist who had first uncovered the connection to Huang Deshi, wrote a long-form article that was published in a national magazine and later translated into multiple languages. It became one of those viral phenomena of the internet age, shared and discussed and debated across social media platforms, spawning countless think pieces and YouTube videos and podcast episodes. Some people saw Yun Feng as a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism and the need for mental health intervention. Others saw him as a tragic figure, someone destroyed by a society that had no place for people like him, no room for those who could not or would not conform to the relentless demands of modern life. Still, others saw him as something more ambiguous, neither hero nor victim, but simply a human being who had pushed the boundaries of experience to their breaking point and found something there that the rest of us could only speculate about. The monastery where Yun Feng had been staying became, much to Master Jing's dismay, something of a pilgrimage site. People came from across China and even from other countries, curious seekers and spiritual tourists who wanted to see where the hermit had been housed, to walk the grounds he had walked, as if proximity to his suffering might confer some kind of insight or blessing. Master Jing turned them away as politely but firmly as he could, explaining that the monastery was not a museum, that Yun Feng was a real person deserving of privacy and dignity, not a spectacle to be gawked at. But the attention was relentless, and eventually the decision was made to move Yun Feng to a more remote location, a small hermitage deep in a different mountain range, where he could have the solitude he craved, without the intrusion of the curious and the concerned. The hermitage was run by an order of nuns who had taken vows of silence, and in this environment, Yun Feng found something approaching peace. He was given a small room that looked out over a valley, and he spent his days sitting by the window, watching the play of light and shadow across the landscape, occasionally walking in the garden when his strength permitted. The nuns left food outside his door and took it away uneaten more often than not, his body continuing its slow process of shutting down, each day bringing him closer to the dissolution he had sought for so long. He did not speak, even when visitors were permitted, which was rare. Dr. Feng came once, several months after the relocation, and sat with Yun Feng for an hour in complete silence, and later told colleagues that it had been one of the most profound experiences of his life, that somehow, in that silence, he had understood things about the nature of consciousness and suffering that years of study had never taught him. Yun Feng's mother passed away in the spring of the following year, and his sisters debated whether to tell him, ultimately deciding that he deserved to know. Yun Mei made the journey to the hermitage, her first and only visit, and sat with her brother in his room while one of the nuns waited discreetly outside. She told him about their mother's final days, how she had spoken of him often, how she had never stopped hoping he would come home, how she had died with his name on her lips. Yun Feng listened without visible emotion, his eyes focused on something beyond the window, beyond the mountains, beyond perhaps even the world itself. When Yun Mei finished, there was a long silence, and then Yun Feng spoke, his voice rusty but clear. He said that their mother was free now, released from the suffering of existence, and that she should be celebrated, not mourned. Yun Mei began to cry, and Yun Feng turned to look at her, really look at her for the first time since she had arrived. He reached out and placed his hand on hers, a gesture so simple and human that it broke her heart. He said that he was sorry, not for leaving, but for the pain his leaving had caused, and that if he could make her understand why it had been necessary, he would, but that some things could not be explained, only experienced. They sat together for a while longer, and then Yun Mei left, and they never saw each other again. The end, when it came, was quiet and unremarkable, as such things often are. Yun Feng died on a morning in late autumn, found by one of the nuns when she came to collect the previous day's untouched meal. He was sitting in his usual position by the window, his body already cold, his face peaceful in a way it had rarely been in life. The local doctor who was called to confirm the death noted that Yun Feng appeared to have simply stopped, his heart ceasing to beat, not from any identifiable pathology, but from what looked like a simple decision to let go. He was 64 years old, though his body bore the marks of someone decades older, worn down by deprivation and exposure, and the sheer effort of maintaining an existence so at odds with human nature. He was cremated according to Buddhist custom, and his ashes were scattered in the mountains he had loved and feared and never truly left, even when his body had been carried down from them. Dr. Lin, who had moved on to other cases but never quite forgotten Yun Feng, wrote a final addendum to his report when he heard of the death. In it, he reflected on what the case had taught him about the limits of psychiatric medicine, about the ways that human beings can reshape their own consciousness through sustained effort and deprivation, and about the impossibility of ever truly knowing what goes on inside another person's mind. He wrote that Yun Feng had been searching for something that might not exist, or that might exist in a form so alien to ordinary experience that language fails to capture it. He wrote that the question of whether Yun Feng had found enlightenment or simply descended into madness might be unanswerable, that the two states might not be as distinct as we like to believe, that the same neurological processes that produce profound spiritual insight might also produce delusion and psychosis, and that from the outside it is nearly impossible to tell the difference. But what haunted Dr. Lin most, what kept him returning to Yun Feng's case in his thoughts even years later, was the question of meaning. Had Yun Feng's life, with all its suffering and isolation and ultimate dissolution, meant something? Had it contributed anything to the world, to human understanding, to the great project of figuring out what we are and why we are here? Or had it been, as some critics suggested, a waste, 30 years of potential lost to a delusion, a talented man who could have contributed to society instead vanishing into a cave and emerging only as a cautionary tale? Dr. Lin did not know the answer, and he suspected that there was no answer, that meaning was something each person had to construct for themselves, and that Yun Feng had constructed his in a way that made sense to him, even if it made no sense to anyone else. The caves in the Zhongnan Mountains continue to draw hermits, though their numbers have dwindled in recent years as China modernizes and the old spiritual traditions fade. Those who do make the journey upward, seeking silence and solitude and perhaps enlightenment, pass by the cave where Yun Feng spent 3 decades of his life. Some stop and peer inside, seeing only darkness and cold stone, unable to imagine what it would be like to stay, to commit to that absolute isolation. Others feel something, a presence or a memory, or just the weight of all that suffering compressed into such a small space, and they move on quickly, disturbed in ways they cannot articulate. And a very few, the ones who are perhaps most like Yun Feng was, feel a pull, a gravity that seems to emanate from the cave itself, calling them inward, promising them something that cannot be found in the world of light and noise and other people. The case of Yun Feng has become a touchstone in discussions about extreme religious practice, mental health, and the ethics of intervention. Should someone like Yun Feng have been forcibly removed from the cave years earlier, before the isolation caused irreversible damage? Or did he have the right to pursue his spiritual practice in whatever form he chose, even if it destroyed him? The questions are not easy, and the answers depend on values and priorities that vary wildly from person to person and culture to culture. What seems clear is that Yun Feng represents an extreme example of something that exists on a spectrum, the human capacity to endure suffering in pursuit of something we believe to be more important than comfort or safety or even sanity. We see it in athletes who destroy their bodies chasing records, in artists who sacrifice everything for their work, in activists who risk their lives for causes they believe in. Yun Feng simply took it further than most of us could ever imagine. And in doing so, he showed us something about the outer limits of human experience. There is a footnote to this story, a small detail that emerged years after Yun Feng's death, and that casts everything in a slightly different light. A group of experienced cave explorers conducting a survey of the Zhongnan cave system for geological research located the vertical shaft that Yun Feng had described, the one where he claimed to have disposed of Huang Deshi's body. They descended into it with proper equipment and found at the bottom, in an underground pool fed by an ancient spring, the remains of a human skeleton. The bones were recovered and subjected to forensic analysis, and the results confirmed that they belonged to a male in his 50s, that they had been there for approximately 2 decades, and that the cause of death could not be determined due to the deterioration of the remains. DNA testing was attempted, but the samples were too degraded. The authorities quietly added this finding to Huang Deshi's file and closed it definitively, noting that while they could not prove the remains were his, the evidence was consistent with Yun Feng's account. What this means is that Yun Feng was telling the truth, at least about this one crucial detail. He had witnessed a death in the cave, and he had disposed of the body exactly as he described. Whether he was truthful about the manner of death, whether Huang Deshi died of natural causes or something else, remains unknown and unknowable. But it suggests that at least some of what Yun Feng said about his time in the cave was grounded in reality, that his memories were not entirely the constructions of a fractured mind. And if that is true, then perhaps other things he said were true as well. The visions, the states of consciousness, the moments of transcendence, or perhaps not. Perhaps he simply told the truth about some things and constructed elaborate fictions about others, and we will never be able to separate the two with any certainty. What remains is the image of a man sitting in a cave for 30 years, slowly disappearing into himself, seeking something that might not exist, or that might exist only in the seeking, enduring cold and hunger and loneliness beyond what most of us could fathom, and emerging only to beg to be locked back in. It is an image that disturbs us because it challenges our assumptions about what human beings want, about what constitutes a good life, about whether the pursuit of spiritual truth can justify the cost it sometimes demands. Yun Feng did say, that the cost was worth it, that those brief moments of clarity were worth 3 decades of suffering. But he is gone now, his ashes scattered to the wind, and we are left with only the story, turning it over in our minds, trying to extract meaning from it, trying to understand what it says about us and the strange, contradictory species we belong to. In the end, perhaps the legacy of Yun Feng is not in any wisdom he attained or any enlightenment he achieved, but simply in the questions he forces us to ask. What would you endure for something you believed in deeply enough? How far would you go in pursuit of truth, or peace, or understanding? And when does devotion become delusion? When does seeking become hiding? When does the cave become not a refuge, but a trap? These are questions without easy answers, questions that each person must wrestle with in their own way. Yun Feng wrestled with them in the darkness of a stone chamber high in the mountains, and he came to his own conclusions. Conclusions that cost him everything and gave him, he claimed, more than everything could ever hold. Whether we believe him, whether we admire him or pity him or simply cannot understand him at all, his story remains a testament to the extremes of human experience and the mystery at the heart of consciousness itself. The cave is still there, waiting in the mountains, silent and dark and infinite in its implications, and somewhere in that silence, perhaps, the echo of Yun Feng's 3 decades still resonates, a question posed to the void that the void, as always, declines to answer.